Shadow Education Minister Stephen Morgan joins us now. Stephen, very good morning to you. First of all, your reaction to this morning's new revelations, the new WhatsApp revelations, and the story as a whole.
Gosh, I mean, people are just sick and tired of this government. I think what we're seeing is just all this infighting in the Conservative Party. People are tired of all this chaos from this government with everything going on. What a huge distraction. I really respect the work of teachers and school support staff across our country. They worked tirelessly during the pandemic, and what we're seeing now is a teacher recruitment and retention crisis. The government are left failing on this, and I want to see action from the government.
Matt Hancock's move to close schools in January 2021. Can you hear me? I was just saying that you didn't oppose the move by the then Health Secretary to close schools in January 2021, so it's a bit rich being critical of it now, is it not?
Well, Labour was always clear that we should follow the science and use the best public health information available to us at the time. Now, if these WhatsApp messages are now telling us that ministers didn't follow advice, that's obviously a huge concern in light of the sacrifices the British public were making and the work of all those on the front line that were keeping us safe. But I mean, it's very clear to me that teachers and school support staff were doing their best in very difficult circumstances at a time that we saw ministers issuing last-minute guidance and, not taking these issues seriously enough. And this is, I think, an example of all this Tory infighting that was the detriment to the British people.
Your leader, Sir Keir Starmer's called for the inquiry, the official inquiry, to be hastened and brought in by the end of the year. There also have been calls for a separate police inquiry. Would you support those calls?
Well, Keir's absolutely right to press the Prime Minister to make sure the inquiry continues. They took a year to develop terms of reference. They took so long to set this up, and we've not had formal hearings yet. So Keir's spot on that. If other countries can move forward with their COVID inquiries, so can the UK. We've got to learn the lessons of the past. It's very clear to me that government weren't prepared with the handling of this pandemic, and we've got to make sure it never happens again.
So if we have a Labour government next year, is that a commitment then that this would be wrapped up more speedily, perhaps almost instantly, under a new Labour administration?
Well, we've got to bring forward the recommendations as quickly as possible. I think we owe it to the British public to do that. Keir's right now calling for the Prime Minister to set out the timeline for this so we can learn the lessons of the past.
What it does give us is an insight into how much WhatsApp is used in the build-up to decision-making and policy-making, although we don't know the minutes of the official meetings that would have taken place to go alongside the WhatsApp messages. Do you use WhatsApp with your parliamentary colleagues, and do you think there's a cautionary tale here?
Well, it's a key way to engage with people on key issues, but it's not the way, in my opinion, that you make decisions that affect the future of our country. So I think the government have got to really reflect on that, and lessons will be learned.
Yeah, it's interesting on a day where children are once again being locked out of classrooms today due to strike action, and given that we're all saying, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that children should be in schools, that Labour hasn't come out and condemned the strikes today.
Well, the responsibility for these strikes and the disruption that they will cause to children and parents rests firmly with this government. They've known for months that strike action was likely, but ministers have not brought the trade unions round the table to hear their views and concerns and negotiate a deal. And we know that teachers are burnt out, they're overworked, they are undervalued by this government, and that's why teachers are leaving in their droves.
Well, to be fair, last week, Gillian Keegan, if I may, just on that point... If I may just pick up on that point, last week...
For half an hour?
Well, no, Gillian Keegan extended the invitation to...
A half an hour meeting?
Because if she said if they held off their strikes today, like the RCN agreed to do, then they could have a proper grown-up conversation. But the unions simply were not prepared to do that.
Well, they were prepared to be in the room, but it was a half an hour conversation. Now, I think that's just tokenistic window dressing. That's not serious negotiation. Labour would have got the unions round the table early on and had a meaningful conversation to find a solution to avoid the disruption that will affect children and parents today.
We're returning to the top story of the day, our big story, those WhatsApp leaked messages to the Telegraph. They reportedly revealed the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock fought a rearguard action in 2021 to shut schools.
Well, let's speak to the Schools Minister, Nick Gibb, who joins us this morning. Look, we are talking about two people who are no longer in the Cabinet. That being said, this is not good reading for the government. And, of course, you were in government at the time of all of this. What's your take on the latest angles?
Well, those WhatsApp messages were messages where people were saying things in the heat of the argument. But I know Gavin Williamson very well. He respects teachers very highly. And, of course, there are big decisions that were being made, very rapidly during that period about whether to keep schools open and so on. But ultimately, we rely on the medical evidence coming from the Chief Medical Officer and from the Department of Health in making those very important decisions. Of course, we want to keep schools open for as long as possible, but we also had to deal with this very new crisis, this pandemic, this virus, against which humans had no immunity. So there were very difficult decisions taken on an hourly basis, on a daily basis, about how to handle this very serious pandemic affecting the world.
Mr Gibb, which side of the argument were you on in this instance? Were you on Boris Johnson's side in this, or were you on the side of Matt Hancock?
Well, look, I was one of the more cautious ministers, but also, I wanted to keep schools open. Ultimately, we rely on the evidence from the Chief Medical Officer, but all this will be coming out in the COVID inquiry. They'll be poring over minutes of meetings, they'll be looking at the evidence supplied by the Chief Medical Officer, as well as discussions between ministers in meetings. So, we know from the Daily Telegraph that just these WhatsApp messages amount to 3 times the words in the King James Bible. So the COVID inquiry will be looking at all that evidence, all other messages between ministers, all the minutes of meetings and the advice given to ministers. It's important that the COVID inquiry looks at these issues so that we can learn the mistakes, we can learn what went right, so that we are better prepared for a future pandemic.
But is that argument, Nick, to wait for the public inquiry gone now, because the public confidence in the public inquiry may well have been shot, given the nature of some of the messages that have come out? Surely you're struggling as the government to maintain confidence in that.
No, it's an independent inquiry. We have absolute confidence in it. And the purpose of the inquiry is to learn those lessons so that we can make sure we are as prepared as we can be should something like this happen in the future. That's the main purpose of it, to learn those lessons. And, the WhatsApp messages just give a very one-sided set of information about what happened during that very intense period of decision-making by ministers and by civil servants. It doesn't tell you the whole story, and that's what the COVID inquiry will be looking at. It's a serious inquiry, it's an independent inquiry, and it's terribly important for future governments to understand, how best to handle such a big international crisis.
Well, you may say it doesn't.
If you look at what happened over that... Go on.
Carry on.
No, if you look at what happened over the period of the pandemic, some decisions were taken that were mistaken, many decisions, most decisions, in my view, were right. And if you look at the way that we managed to be one of the first countries to have a vaccine, the way, that we handled all those very difficult decisions, I think actually we handled that crisis as well as we could have. But that's what the COVID inquiry will be looking into. It's a very difficult period for this country, for the world, and we just need to make sure we learn the lessons from that very intense period of decision making.
Yeah, and look, you said a moment ago that Gavin Williamson, you know him personally, and you believe he has respect for teachers. Many teachers this morning will simply not believe you, given the leaked messages that have been read now that show that he thought teachers were lazy, that they didn't want to get into the classroom, that the pandemic was an excuse for them.
That's not what he thinks. I know that isn't what he thinks.
Well, that's
People
what he
say
said.
all kinds of things in the heat of the moment. in the heat of the moment when he might have been angry for a split second. But actually, I know his wife is a primary school teacher, and I know that he has the highest regard for teachers, as I do as well, and particularly during the pandemic. People think that schools closed during the pandemic. They didn't, actually. They were open the whole time for vulnerable children and the children of critical workers. Teachers were also holding remote lessons for the children that were at home. And when the schools were open, they had to make sure that children were abiding by all the COVID security rules, hand hygiene, social distancing. So they were really working, really going that extra mile during the COVID crisis to make sure that children were having the best education they could while being at home, and also, you know, providing a face-to-face education for vulnerable children and children of critical workers. So all of us in government, particularly in the Department for Education, have the highest regard for teachers, not just during the pandemic, but throughout, you know, the day-to-day, even in normal times as well.
Well, you may say all these messages were sent in the heat of the moment, but what they really do is paint a picture that government comms on COVID and perhaps many other things weren't exactly, and certainly don't match what was going on behind the scenes. How would you respond to that?
No, the comms reflected what people were thinking in private. Those WhatsApp messages, as I said, heat of the moment, people were angry about a particular decision. You know, ministers discuss issues behind closed doors in meetings. There are disagreements about some very difficult decisions that had to be taken. But then ultimately, we rely on the evidence of the experts, the chief medical officer, decisions are taken, and then we all roll behind those decisions, and that's precisely what happens in government. And during the COVID crisis, of course, that's an even more intense period of decision making, and people get have very heated discussions behind closed doors. But then you reach a decision, and those decisions are implemented, and that's precisely what happens. And the public comms reflect those decisions, but they also reflect what people genuinely think about the teaching profession and what they genuinely think is the best way of handling this crisis. Yeah,
it's interesting. You've said repeatedly that it's important to learn the lessons of the pandemic. One of the big lessons that I think we can all agree on is that the right place for children to be is in schools. And yet here we are, day 3 of strikes across England. Here in London, both of our children at home due to strikes today. And yet we hear that you missed a vital meeting with unions off on holiday. Is the government taking this seriously?
Yes, look, the Secretary of State was there. I was away for a long-planned trip with my mother-in-law, my husband, and this is mischief-making because one of the joint General Secretaries of the NEU was away during half-term, and I say she's entitled to her holiday during half-term, and I hope she had a refreshing holiday, and I hope she's now ready to start those negotiations. We wrote to the NEU last week, and the government also wrote to the Royal College of Nursing last week, offering very serious negotiations about pay, about workload, about all the issues that are important to nurses and are important to teachers. The Royal College of Nursing accepted those discussions. They agreed to postpone the strikes, which was a condition for starting those negotiations, and they're now in intense discussions. But the NEU decided not to accept those discussions, those conditions to pause the strikes, and that's why we're going ahead. They're going ahead with the strike today, and I think it's unfortunate, particularly as children have had a disrupted education over the last 2 years during the pandemic. I think we should be around the table having those discussions about pay and all the issues that are important to teachers.
Unless the parties are on long-planned holidays.
Look, you know, I was in daily contact with the office during that period. This was a long-planned trip with my 93-year-old mother-in-law to the Far East. It was cleared with the Secretary of State. She was here. It didn't in any way affect the negotiations with the National Education Union. And this is just mischief-making because, as I said, one of the joint General Secretaries was on holiday during half-term, and I say that she's perfectly entitled to do that. People work hard and they need to have their breaks. But, you know, it didn't affect the negotiations. The Secretary of State was leading those negotiations while I was away, and I was in daily contact also, and also joining meetings during that period. But what we need to do now is for the National Education Union to pause these strikes, to get round the negotiating table, to talk about pay. That's what we want to talk about, both 2022 and 2023 pay, and to talk about things like workload and recruitment and retention of teachers. That's what we should be doing right now. And you know, the NEU should not be going on strike, disrupting children's education and disrupting family life, working life, and childcare. All those issues that people should not be having to put up with that thing just because the NEU can't decide, because of their own internal politics, to postpone these strikes this week.
And Nick, speaking about disruption to students and indeed parents, special needs children to get further investment today. This is part of your improvement plan. We know that some parents have had to give up their jobs because of a lack of local support if they have children with special learning needs. And acceptance here, it seems that there are significant weaknesses in support for special educational needs.
Yeah, this is an important day. We're announcing the Special Educational Needs and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan to make sure that families don't have to go through very challenging times, making sure that their children have the right provision in school. So this improvement plan means that we'll have a set of standards that means that in mainstream schools, if a child has moderate special educational needs, they will get the right teaching for those children in those schools. We're training 5,000 early years special educational needs teachers. We're also opening 33 new special schools for those children with more severe special educational needs. We're spending £10 billion a year on special educational needs, and that's a 50% increase in funding for those children over the last 4 years. So this is a very important day about how do we make it easier for families with children that have special educational needs and disabilities to ensure they have the right provision in the right place and that it's properly funded. And that's what we're announcing today.